Well, welcome everybody. Glad you're here. Glad we have a large turnout for a very special speaker tonight. So Francis and I were trying to figure out, we think this is our 5th of this series of emotional healing lecture series. And so we've covered grief and loss and authentic self and trauma and just these different pieces within our world. And I love this group because it's a mix of everybody of our talent. And that's special in itself. So thank you very much for being here. My name's Ted Wired. I'm the founder of Golden Willow Counseling, as well as Golden Willow Retreat. I'm the clinical director of Rio Grande Treatment as well. And Lawrence, thank you. You did a lot of work to make sure we're able to do these things, and was able to get this space from Kit Carson Electric. And usually these are every second Thursday of the month. This one was a little strange just because it was a little strange. We don't know why, but we're here on a third, but I do know it's supposed to be every second. And so we'll keep having special speakers, and if you know of somebody or a certain passion that you wish to bring forth, let Lawrence or myself know. Carol, Lori, Melissa, and the Rio Grande team, thank you so much for making sure we always have some munchies and pulling everything off. And even if we did all that, if the rest of us didn't show up, we wouldn't have anything. So appreciate that. Sign in. Some people are here for classes and different programs. Please make sure you've signed in. That's how you get credit. Other people with licensures may sign in to get 2.5 CEUs. Hi, Kathleen. That's good to see you. And so please sign in. Also, if you just want to make sure you're on our email list, we'll get that. For the CEU certificate, we will email it to you. So if you don't receive it after a couple weeks, let us know. It just means we had something get lost in Cyberville. So, but Lawrence and I last year were talking, actually driving back from Vegas, and we were going, we really need to do some more support for our town. We each have our organizations and we keep things going, but how do we give back of just that intellectual and emotional handhold that allows all of us to be of service in different ways? And so we came up with this lecture series, and I think that's so awesome. And Kit Carson Electric Co-op donated the room for us, and so we appreciate that. Just some details. Sherry will take a break at some point, but I do believe in self-care. If you need to go to the restroom or something, they're out this way and down the hallway. We're not supposed to wander all around Kit Carson, so go to the restroom and come on back here, but that's where they are. If you're able to, please turn off your cell phones. Many of us are on call, so if you need to, put them on silence or vibrator or buzzer or whatever they're calling it these days, and then go ahead and take your call up there and come back. Now, one thing we do like to check in with, we are covering a lot of emotional world because it's emotional healing. It means there is a possibility of certain triggers showing up. There are a lot of counselors in this room. So if you feel yourself getting triggered, I'll be in the back. And other therapists are around if you have a certain person that you know. And just go and please say, hey, I need a little help. When we leave, if you're still feeling a little spinny, please let one of us know. I'm happy to walk around the parking lot whenever it saves a life or helps someone stay sober. So please, we want to make sure if anything has bubbled up that's causing you to be a little shaky, let's help you get regrounded before you leave. And it's also going to be very dark because it's that time of the year. Anything else, Lawrence, or did I get it covered? So, and I get to introduce a friend of mine many, many years ago. How many? 13, 14 years ago. I was up in Canada giving a talk on addiction and grief and loss. And, you know, we're just little old Golden Willow Retreat, kind of Taos Hondo dog style. And so I have my little bag of stuff, but I'm not a big company, and so I can't afford to have a table to put out my information. And I run into this very awesome lady, and she's very interested, and she's listening, and she's really, really, really interested. And she hears the story, and she hears about Golden Willow, and she takes her table, and she goes, here's half. Put your stuff down here. Other people need to know about Golden Willow Retreat. Well, from there, we'd bounce into each other at different conferences and talk to each other. Then one day I saw her in Taos, and she had moved here, and I was like, whoa! And we've stayed very close friends and colleagues. We were giving a bunch of talks down in Austin earlier this year and messed up with the airplane world, and they said, well, you can get home in 2 days, so we just jumped in a car and drove all the way home, and had a blast doing that. It did take 3 blizzards at the different Dairy Queens on the way. But it was a very sober and emotionally sober trip, and we did get here. But what I've noticed is Sherry is all about heart, all about sobriety in different forms, and I lean on her heavily for helping me help others to get to different treatment centers around the country. She knows more than anyone I know of all the different treatments. She's helped me in my personal world with family members as well as many different clients. We were helping someone one time, and the father had come in, and Sherry goes, well, you know, Ted has a lot of traveler miles with me. And he looks at me, how many treatment centers have you been to, Ted? No, I helped others get into treatment. But it's really nice when you can have in our little rural frontier areas someone who's an enormous asset where you can call, and even if she doesn't have the answer, works so hard to help people. And I have not seen anyone with as much passion, no matter what state or country we've been in, that's about healing. About sobriety, emotional sobriety, and just bottom line healing as well as connecting. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Sherry Young, who now lives in Taosenia. She's been here long enough now, and she gets to talk about emotional sobriety. Thank you all for being here tonight.
What a great group. So hi, everybody. You know, this is a little daunting for me to do this because several years ago, I went to the International AA Convention in Atlanta, and Lawrence Medina was one of the international speakers, and he spoke on emotional sobriety. So, you know, standing in his shadow is going to be really difficult because I still remember many of the things that he said, and I thought, what a powerful talk. And wow, he came from Taos, you know, so Taos is a surprise to me all the time, and it's full of good things. Thank you, Ted, for the introduction, and, you know, I just cherish the way that we've been able to work together on behalf of so many people. Really grateful for that. I know many of you in this room from many rooms, and really grateful to see you tonight, and you know, then just friends from the community as well. So thank you for being here. So the topic tonight is after sobriety, what? And I can remember, you know, years back thinking, sobriety, are you kidding me? Like, life is over if you're not out there drinking and having a good time. Like, what do people do who don't drink? I mean, it had become kind of like a lifetime, you know, activity for me. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is looking at sobriety as that point of entry to various layers and levels of healing. And those layers and levels of healing, I'm going to use some diagrams, and I hope these are going to be helpful to you. I believe that you have the handouts. And what you're going to see is that even though we're going to talk about them as layers and levels, they really interact all the time. And even the bottom layers have, certain characteristics that you're experiencing at your first point of entry into sobriety. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. So a couple things, I'm just going to share kind of like a little thumbnail about my story. I grew up in an alcoholic home. My father was the alcoholic. He was also a magna cum laude graduate of the University of Michigan in the School of Engineering. So I'm hoping that you have a type of man in mind. Incredibly OCD. Christmas was awful at our house because he would get out a slide rule and it had a ceiling kind of like this, and he would have 3 different colors of balls that he would hang in various distance lengths from the ceiling, and the exact distance apart from one another, never hanging 2 colors exactly together. So it was hell at our house the entire time that he was doing that. And of course, nobody could help because they couldn't do it as perfectly as he did. So he was a binge drinker, alcoholic, rageaholic. What that meant for me is that you never knew what you're going to get. And on the other hand, he was also vice president of a steel company. My mom's drug of choice was my father because she was a self-appointed manager of the alcoholic. And some of you in this room know about that as well. So for me, because it was an unsafe and unstable environment, I mean, there was always food on the table, we always had clothes, but there was a preoccupation with the alcoholism. And so it was like nobody had the time or the energy to see me or my sister. And so this was just what it was. I mean, nobody was using the term alcoholism back in those days. It was in the late 40s, early 50s. And basically my strategy for managing how to be a part of that family was escape. And so I rode my bike everywhere. I had friends. I got involved in all kinds of school activities. My mode of escape was perfection, performance. I was just going to be little Miss Everything. I was sort of a goody two-shoes. My nickname in boarding school and high school, where I had escaped from this family, was the Vestal Virgin. So, which was appropriate. I mean, it was a Christian school, right? And it was high school. So that was kind of how I lived. And I had no idea that those coping mechanisms and those strategies of escape would be the kind of like way I would live my way into my marriage, into raising my children. I was, at the time I was living in Texas, I was a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of gal, tough talking Texan. And, you know, my philosophy was, if what you're doing is not working, try harder. So that falls into the same kind of category that we hear in the rooms, that insanity is continuing to do the same thing, expecting different results. I was insane. And I was also, you know, so dedicated to making things better. And I couldn't quite figure out how I could do that. So it cost me 2 long-term marriages. The first marriage, 15 years. I had 4 children in 6 years. I was busy. I was escaping. I got a PhD. And then 10 minutes after that divorce, I entered into another relationship with my husband's best friend and former boss. And started that marriage for 13 years. And I really wanted to make this work. And I couldn't. And that was really hard for me to accept. 3 years after that second divorce, I found the rooms of AA, and I went in thinking, oh my God, you have got to be kidding me. I'm rolling my eyes at the aphorisms on the wall, and I'm thinking to myself, am I really going in here with these people? Today, those are my people. And it was a first step meeting, and I walked out of that meeting wanting what those men and women had. And today, I got it up here, I just forget. Today, I've got what they had and what they wanted. So, for my name up on the first slide, I put up there that, yeah, I'm a professional and I work in the treatment industry. I work as an independent consultant. So in that world, I'm Sherry Young, PhD. CSAT stands for Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. But to all of you, I'm Sherry Y. Because I'm a grateful member of Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon. And next month, on the 14th, I get to celebrate 23 years of sobriety. So for those of you who started late in sobriety like me, I was 52 when I got sober. And I am so grateful because it really opened my eyes and helped me understand why I couldn't accomplish the goals that I had back then in those marriages and when I was raising my kids. I also have to say that I have 2 adult children. I have three kids, all adults, raising families, and 2 of them are in long-term sobriety, and 1 of them is in therapy and has been for many years. So this is a miracle. I'm a miracle. And every one of you who has had the courage to begin a path of healing, you're a miracle. All right, so let's see if I can do this. So when I talk about sobriety, I want you to know that you don't have to get drunk or be a drunk and get sober to have sobriety. There's a broader sense of sobriety that really has to do with a kind of consciousness and a kind of connection with others. When I say sobriety, and as it relates to drugs or alcohol, I mean stopping using mind-altering substances, but also stopping using mind-altering thinking and behavior. So in the broad sense, as Richard Rohr says, he's a Franciscan priest. I'm sure many of you know of him down in Albuquerque at the Center for Action and Contemplation. He's written a book called Breathing Underwater, which if you have any history with addiction, you want to look at that book because it's awesome. He says at the very core, every one of us is addicted to our own way of thinking. And so long after we've put aside the drinking or the drugs, we're still addicted to our own thinking. And clearing that up and getting conscious about that is the beginning of healing and emotional sobriety. Many of us long into sobriety are addicted to ego defenses, to control, judgment, isolation, self-sabotage. I mean, when I use the word addicted, I think of unconscious. unconscious. And you know, the last year of my drinking career, and I say it was a career because I was a college professor at the time, and you know, was teaching the big 500 student lecture classes. And I would come home, and every day I would say, I'm not going to do it today. I'm not going to do it today. And every day my car just naturally turned into the liquor store, and I bought another 2-liter bottle of wine, and I would go home, skip dinner, and drink directly from the bottle. Even my beautiful Crate and Barrel 20-ounce glasses that could hold 1 liter at a time, you know, were gone at that point. And I drank from those glasses so that when my son called me and said, how much have you had to drink, Mother? I could say, I've only had 2 drinks. So when I think of the word addicted, I think of unconscious. And for me, drinking was a solution. It wasn't the problem. I couldn't see it as the problem because it worked for me on so many levels. It medicated that emotional pain that I had been living with since I was a young child. And you know, so my drinking had become a survival mechanism, just like those early mechanisms of escape, of perfection, performance, you know, busyness. All right, so I've created this little slide for you, and those of you who are in recovery, in, you know, AA or NA, notice that the triangle is the symbol that is on many of our coins. And what I've done is to section this off into 3 kind of sections. So first we're going to talk about addiction and sobriety and what the characteristics of that, you know, really are. But what I want you to see is that addiction is really the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. So let's just think about it this way. Say you're in a small boat, sailing along in the clear, pristine Alaskan waters. Ted, you know what that's like, right? And you spot this beautiful, shimmering object off in the distance. And it glows with this really kind of beautiful blue shimmer. And it's floating on the water. And it seems like it's a long way off, so you can continue on your course because you want to get close to it to see it better. And then suddenly you crash. And you're like, what the? And your boat is torn apart, and you're tossed into the icy waters, and you're thinking, what happened? So, for starters, I'd like you to see that upper part of the triangle above the surface as really all there is, even though what caused that crash was what you didn't see below the surface. So let's imagine that beautiful shimmering object, the tip of the iceberg, as whatever makes life work for you. So drugs, alcohol, gambling, excessive work, focus on others, control. These become our drugs of choice because they work. They offer temporary relief and sometimes in the forms of numbness, escape, fun, feeling normal, feeling important, feeling like you're somebody. I've heard so many people in the room say, yeah, after I, had a few drinks, I could really dance. But that was their perception that they could dance. Who knows if that was really true? I mean, I thought after, drinking, I could give even better lectures. I wonder, what would happen if I met some of those students today and what their experience of that was. So these, we've learned to count on these coping mechanisms, and so they become our methods of self-medication. And they work until they don't. And there's a point at which they always stop working. And the reason they stop working is because they're external fixes trying to solve an internal problem. And yes, they work for a while, and then they don't. And then, what do? So the crash happens, and things fall apart in our lives through consequences, and in our souls, in the experience of incomprehensible demoralization. And I had a lot of consequences that last year of drinking. I had 6 car accidents in 1 year, and one of them I flew off a 140-foot cliff. It's hard to imagine that they have those in Texas, right? But it was right behind Cowboy Stadium, over in a hilly section called Irving, Texas. It was the old Cowboy Stadium. And I missed the turn and jumped the curb and went off this cliff and flew 140 feet in the air, missing a huge metal power station. And my little Miata came down just millimeters in front of a tree. And I lived. And I'd look in the mirror and I'd say to myself, what is going on with me? I'm a normal person. I've got a job. I've got degrees. And that didn't make any difference. So the essential feature, I think, of addiction is using. So even if we're not using drugs or alcohol, we're using people, we're using power, prestige, anything that will make us better or feel better. So we use these externals to medicate emotional and spiritual pain. And using is typically unconscious because it becomes increasingly isolating. So on that first line up there, you can see the waves going along, and you think about what you can see. So it's using, and it's unconscious, and it's isolating. So the worse things get, the more shame we usually have, and we pull back, and we don't want anybody to know what we're really doing. So the crash. So in the 12 and 12 of Alcoholics Anonymous, we're told that the crash is a good thing. And in fact, it says, only through utter defeat are we able to take our first steps toward liberation and strength. So I'm the kind of a person that tries to figure this out, and I think, well, why can't I just think my way into that without the crash? Why can't I just make these changes based on, rational cognitive observations? But it doesn't work that way for most of us. In fact, some of us are too smart for our own good, and that gets in the way because for every, method that we think of fixing our lives, there's usually, a reaction that says, oh, but then I could do it this way, and find new ways to drink or use.
Sure, you speak a little loud.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So it's the DUI. It's the threat of divorce. It's broken relationships. It's work problems. The loss of a job. Medical consequences. These are the things that usually get our attention, and usually the crash is big. But the gift of desperation inspires change, and in whatever form that crash or that intervention comes, there's an opening for change. And if you can imagine the water line beginning to move down the triangle from that first meeting or that first day in treatment, there comes a growing consciousness and connection begins to happen. It may even be just one person in a group that you're in, and that person says something and you think, that's my experience. So you begin to experience connection. So there's a growing consciousness and connection, but at this juncture, it's important to begin to discover and name the pain that we were medicating. And this is the critical why of addiction: self-medication and self-generated survival strategies. So all of you who received a handout have a little ACE test. And before we actually take that quiz, I want to tell you about this study, because I actually just learned about this about 5 years ago. Kaiser Permanente in the state of California conducted a study of 17,000 men and women. Most of them, the percentage was over the age of 50. And most of the participants were white and college educated. So I'm thinking with those parameters and those populations, the scores we're going to see, if they were applied to, minorities, marginalized folks, people with low economic status, people who have not been educated, the numbers are going to go up. And so what this study did is it basically worked through primary care physician offices. So when people came in to see their primary care physician, they were asked to take this 10-question quiz. And the quiz actually covers 3 areas that are important for you to understand. I'm going to go away from that for a while. So the types of ACEs that it measures are abuse, and under abuse, it's emotional, physical, and sexual. And then household challenges, a mother who was treated violently. Or I would say, there are some subtleties that this test doesn't quite catch, because it could be a father who was treated violently by a raging mother. Substance abuse in the home, mental illness in the home, separation and divorce, incarceration. These are all, and I would also add to that if, there's a person with, extreme medical needs, what happens in that family is that all of the attention really goes to that person, and rightfully so. But what happens to the other kids in the family who aren't being seen and aren't really being cultivated and cared for? And then the final, area that they looked at was emotional neglect and physical neglect. Now, neglect can be overt or benign. So either, the parents are just so busy and so consumed with whatever is preoccupying them with household challenges or abuse that's going on, that they can't really, pay attention to the kids, or they're busy with their lives, maybe working, several jobs, maybe climbing the ladder, financially and with their jobs. And so the kids become latchkey kids, and they're essentially, kids who are raising themselves. So very interesting study. Okay. So these questions we're not asking this to blame your family or the situation in which you found yourself. We're asking these questions so that you begin to connect the dots and understand why you felt the need to self-medicate in whatever ways you've done that. And once you have identified that, I hope that you will come to the same sense of self-forgiveness, because of course you did what you did. You had to. It was way too painful. And if you didn't drink or drug, you used some other forms of escape and self-medication and self-protection, control, judgment, buttoned up, keeping everything in place, because your life was coming apart at the seams. So I just want to show you that some of the consequences of adverse childhood experiences develop, and if I could just come over here, develop out of intergenerational issues that have been under the carpet, under the surface in your family, generation after generation after generation. So one of the things that I have said to my kids is, I want to break the cycle. And so far among my kids, that is true. I do have a grandson who was sober for 5 years, and he was amazing in that sobriety, and he's back out there. So the next generation doesn't quite, he's one of 6 grandchildren, and he doesn't have it right now. But historical trauma, things that have been going on, secrets that have been kept in your family for many, many years, and many people went to their grave with those secrets. And you're left wondering what was going on. What was that really about? Social conditions, in the early part of my adulthood, I had married a guy who didn't like to work. And so we were really poor and really struggled to be able to provide for our children. I struggled to be able to provide for the children. And so I taught myself to sew, and I made undershirts and just crazy things like that. Made all their food. My kids would come to me and say, why can't we eat cafeteria food like the normal kids? And I'd say, well, because you don't have a normal mother, that's why. So adverse childhood experiences, all these things that you've just seen on that test, create a disrupted neurodevelopment. So your brains were on overload. You were hypervigilant. You were actually not knowing where, when the other shoe was going to drop. You didn't know where danger was coming from. You didn't know how to be safe. You were a little kid. And probably if your home was anything like mine, nobody was talking about anything. So what does this do when that prefrontal cortex goes offline and is just on such an overload and hijacked by these life stressors? Well, we experience social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, and we make choices. And so we come up with survival strategies, like we talked about earlier, that work until they don't work. And we get into high-risk health behaviors. I mean, putting alcohol in our bodies it's a poison. What makes us think that that's a good thing to do? What I figured out is even though it was poison, it took my brain offline for a little while and gave me a little bit of relief. And my kids, because I was a micromanager. So disease, disability, and social problems, liver disease, kidney disease, heart, many times this can be linked to addiction, but not in the medical reports. So my father died at 49 of a massive coronary, And they said it was a heart attack, but the stress that he lived with as a binge drinker, rageaholic, alcoholic was really what killed him. So this is a powerful study, and I hope you'll take some time if you're seeing a counselor and you go ahead and take this test into them, or if you're working with a sponsor, take it in and just say, whoa, what do I do with all of this? And if that person goes, whoa, I don't know what you do with all of that, call one of us and we'll help you. So, we're still up in the tip of the iceberg, and let's say we get sober. And we're able to, through the help of meetings, maybe treatment, we put aside, the substance, whether it's alcohol, cocaine, amphetamines, tobacco, benzodiazepines, all of the self-medications. So we put that away, and we don't really change much of anything other than just now we're going to meetings, and we're able to say in those meetings, I've got 10 days sober, I've got 30 days sober. But if we haven't addressed the core underlying drivers of those addictions, and if we don't know why we've been using, in the past, what typically will happen is we switch drug of choice. So how many times do you see people who put aside the drink or the drug and they start to gain weight? Or, they're 13-stepping, everybody in the 12-step meetings. Does everybody know what that means? It means that they're looking for the next hookup. And vulnerable new people in sobriety and in the rooms of AA, NA, are, vulnerable, right? And so how easy would it be to have a hookup and say, let's just feel good for a while? Or what about excessive work? So this is what I did in early sobriety. I threw myself into my work because I wasn't drinking, so what else was there? And I was single, I wasn't married. I wasn't living, in the same place as my kids. I also threw myself into extreme exercise. I, was an avid runner. And I also was concerned about my family, so I was fixing others. So my drugs of choice moved from, this left-hand box over to the right-hand box. But what I had is the same core effect states. I was, even though I was sober, I was going to meetings all the time, seeing a sponsor. I was living with despair, intensity, and risk. If somebody wasn't intense, they were boring. When people in AA would talk about maturity or moderation, I would think, boring. They're no fun. Self-loathing, shame, misery, rage. And the reason is because of the addiction interaction cycle, that has not been broken. So the same cycle and the same way that our brains and bodies work, the big book is really great about talking about obsession of the mind and allergy of the body. So that was back in 1935. I think today, with all of the brain research that has been done, they wouldn't talk about the allergy of the body. They would talk about what happens, in the in the brain neurotransmitters and how those go offline, are hijacked. And so the executive functioning of the brain absolutely is shut down. So any decision-making capability, it just isn't there. And what also happens is that the limbic brain, which is the emotional brain, goes offline too, and so people get numb and they just stop, they just can't feel anything. Or the other extreme is that they're in great pain and just miserable sober. And I call that the whack-a-mole cycle. So what happens is that same pattern of fantasy, escape, disassociation, leads to finding something that is going to produce arousal, excitement, intensity, or risk. I got into some really bad business ventures and made commitments financially that I really shouldn't have been involved in and couldn't support. So that was another crash that happened to me at 10 years sober. Going to meetings, seeing a sponsor on a regular basis, working the steps. But I hadn't gotten to those core issues, and I really hadn't done emotional healing. So what happens is that arousal evidently, leads to numbing and satiation. So we feel good for a period of time, and then all of a sudden we're feeling deprived, and the craving starts all over again, and we start fantasizing and disassociating, and that cycle is the black hole. And many people, in sobriety, notice I didn't say recovery because I want to distinguish between sobriety and recovery, experience that cycle. The black hole may look like sobriety, but it's not full recovery until the cross addiction ends. So if you're several years into recovery and you're still having money problems, how about doing a fourth step on that? How about really looking at why that's going on for you, and what is it, that scarcity in you, that is so obsessed with those issues? Great form of relief. So sobriety and recovery, we can experience this, them both at the same time, but not at the same levels of depth and transformation. So I have a sponsee who basically taught me that growth in sobriety brings relief, but relief is not the same as recovery. So sober for the addict means not using substances. Sober for others affected by addiction means not using helping or fixing to change the way they feel about themselves. So recovery really, I love this play on words, and I was actually trained as a Jungian, and so, wordplay is really exciting for me. So recovery means replacing old patterns with new. It's about a realignment. It's about remembering. So reconnecting, recreating, putting the members back together, putting the pieces back together. It's about restoration. It's kind of like taking an old piece of of beat up furniture and having a woodworker go to work on it and transform it so that old piece becomes new. But it's new in the sense that it doesn't forget all that it has gone through. That's not wiped out in that piece of furniture. Many years ago, I visited a treatment center that worked with adolescents, and they had an old beat-up car that had been in a bunch of accidents, and it was right there at the treatment center, and the boys and the girls worked with a mechanic and a body guy who taught them how to restore this car. And it was such an incredibly powerful metaphor of transformation and what was happening to them. So they didn't do the body work until the very end. They had to take care of the engine and all the running parts first. And then they could make it look different. So please see these diagrams that I show you as a kind of progression that continue on and develop, but they also gather up everything that's below the surface, that all of these recovery and emotional sobriety are actually present, even in those early stages, even if you don't get it, even if you can't explain it, even if it's not completely transformative. It takes time, and it's a process.
We're going to jump back in. Thank you, Sherry White. Never called you that before. We've started a new thing that we've been working on. Luckily, we got to have a meeting earlier today and have a presentation for a lot of the different supports within our town. The Golden Willow Counseling and Rio Grande just today really started a central intake. And our hope is that slowly as our central intake grows from just the addiction world and recovery within that addiction world, is that we're able to refer out and be able to work these different areas. So if you know someone or yourself who's needing intensive outpatient, you'll be able to call the central intake. They'll be able to do the first parts of that paperwork and help you either get to Golden Willow or Rio Grande, as well as what we talk about so much in our world, and it's a lot what Sherry's talking about, is also how do we do those wraparound so that the whole family is getting the supports and the community is getting the supports from the state and the country, and onward from there, that whole ripple effect. So thanks to Lawrence, Lori, Melissa, and a larger team, Larry, we really worked to build this central intake so somebody can call and we can help them get to the services needed. Because what happens so often within addiction and just actually any type of emotional healing is that little gap, that little area from that phone call to maybe not getting to that support, we fall through. Also within the addictive brain, that window's open and I want help, and if I don't get those supports, that window closes really quickly because our system just wants to go back to what it's already used to, usually normalized trauma. So you're going to hear more and more about the central intake, and you'll be able to call. So please keep your eyes and ears and open on that. Also, Golden Willow Counseling continues to have its grief groups over on Sipapu off of Salazar on Wednesday evenings. So if you need information on that, please check in with Golden Willow. You know, what Sherry's talking about so much is we get caught in shame and then we don't start to crawl out. And so that chance, and I always like to think about what you're talking about, Sherry, is, you know, we have these different events in our life, but then we judge them with our wisdom today. Well, how did we get the wisdom today? From all those different events in our life, and being open to being gentle to yourself as we look in our past and realize our past was giving us this chance to be here tonight. And so, Sherry, thank you, and jump back in.
Thanks, Ted. Ted just told you what I'm going to say for the rest of it. We could probably just all go home. So those of you who did not get an ACE test, Lawrence told me that he's got several of them at his office. His business card is up here. The office is just right down the street down here. So he can either email it to you or get it to you one way or another. So, you know, and you know, think about this. This might be a test for, you know, other members of your family. Use discernment with that. But, you know, if somebody's curious and is confused about, what's going on, that it just might be a way to open that conversation and lead into some understanding and some depth and, begin to walk a different path. So I want to continue by looking at how we've brought things below the surface up above. And what we recognize is that sobriety and recovery offer us a broader field of perception. So that triangle grows. And with it, and not with it, but how it grows is through all of the resources that we cultivate that help us see from a different perspective. So going to meetings, fellowship afterwards. I was really bad about that for a lot of years. I wouldn't go to coffee. I was too busy. I had other fish to fry. But it's the coffee afterwards. It's the time that you spend just talking with people outside the meetings where things really begin to come home. The prayers have been really important to me, and connecting with other people who have similar stories. And it's surprising if I take the time to listen to people's stories, I think, oh, I'm not alone. This person gets it. And so what we're going from that point of not using through sponsorship and steps to transparency and becoming increasingly conscious. So this sober person is beginning to live from the inside out. Remember before we had said that constantly people are reaching for the externals that can self-medicate or numb or cause us to change our feelings. Now, all of a sudden, there's this core of, sobriety and recovery, of consciousness, of presence that allows us to begin from the inside out. So any person who has begun that process, when those dings of life approach us, and they always do, they never stop. We're not totally taken off balance. It's not the crash that sends us down for the count. In July, I found, a condo that I own had a red tag saying that I had delinquent taxes from 2015. And I got to tell you guys, I'm a good citizen. I pay my bills, and my taxes were supposed to have been paid through my escrow and my mortgage, and they weren't. And so my house was on the auction block. And a friend called me and said, "Hey, Sherry, did you know your name was in the paper? Your house is up for auction." Whoa. And I've got to tell you, there would have been a time where that self-righteous, anger would have, welled up, and I would have gone into that Taos County tax office with middle fingers blazing. And by the grace of God and the work that I've done in this program, I was able to walk into that office and say, "I've got a problem, I need your help." That's not me, folks. And I'm so grateful for the transformation that is happening in my life because I could do it differently. So those old wounds and the pain that they brought about have begun to heal. And hiding and isolation gradually becomes a thing of the past. And transparency and openness allows us to live in relationship. I can remember, the 10th step says, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. I read that and I thought, are you kidding me? You don't understand that if I admit to any wrong at all, I will break apart in a million pieces, because then I'll be wrong about everything. How's that for alcoholic thinking? right? So, things change. And today, admitting that I'm wrong is like no big deal. I mean, it's like, yeah, I'm wrong, about many things. And I don't break apart when I'm able to admit that. In fact, I'm finding now that level of vulnerability really has caused me to kind of join the human race and be, a fellow among fellows, a worker among workers. I don't always get it right. And that's okay. I am a limited human being, and I do the best I can. So recovery people are no longer using people. We're not using externals as we used to use drugs and alcohol to make us feel different. And the big, the 12 and 12 says selfishness and self-centeredness slip away. And as they do, empathy and compassion are what create connection with our fellows. So I'm going to get real 12-steppy here for just a minute. And I'm going to talk about this authenticity cycle, because really what we're doing in recovery is returning to that authentic God-created self that we were meant to be. So when we were using, we weren't our authentic self. That wasn't who we are in our core being. And it certainly wasn't who we were created to be, right? So I think about the steps in this way, and I divide them up into basically 4 parts. So steps 1 through 3 is really about God. And this is a tough one for some people who come in to the rooms and they've had, either religious abuse or, they really just can't even say the word God. And that's why, we often refer to God as a higher power. Anything that is more powerful than we are. It could be energy, creation, creator, spirit is one that I really like. So, what we realize is that steps 1 through 3 are really about finding our source. So we've been operating out of our own mind and our own perceptions, our own way of dealing with the world, and most of that has been coping mechanisms because we were self-medicating pain that we couldn't even name. So what and who is my source? And how do I cultivate a conscious contact with that source? So I love step 2 because it says came to believe. And I came to believe 23 years ago. I sort of had come to believe before that. That's all changed. 23 years ago, the God of my understanding was different than the God of my understanding today. And by the grace of God, if I continue in down this path, the God of my understanding in 10 years will be very different, because my experience with that God and my connection with that God will have grown and will have changed. And in that connection, I'm changed because of the connection. So steps 1 through 3, basically what we're looking for is a source of power, love, energy, wisdom. Fill in the blanks, whatever is the highest value for you. God, higher power, spirit, creator, sometimes the group, higher consciousness. When we're open, our perception begins to change and grow, and it never stops unless we do. Okay? So steps 4 through 7 are really steps where we're looking at ourselves. and where we're coming to understand what's driving our thinking and behaviors. So in steps 4 through 7, we work to see ourselves with God's eyes. I don't know about you, but when I looked at myself and my past behavior and thinking, I was pretty ashamed of that and pretty hard on myself. But that isn't seeing me through God's eyes. And that's also not seeing me in the light of the emotional pain that I experienced as a little kid growing up. So, working to see ourselves with God's eyes, the past, the present, self, and others, all of this gets transformed. So we engage the God of our understanding from steps 1 through 3, which we've already done. And as our eyes are opened, we begin to experience the paradigm shift. So, for example, I can look at certain people in politics, and we're not going to mention any names, but I guarantee you there were major family of origin issues that affected these people, so that's why they're behaving and thinking the way that they are today. And, I don't know what it takes for a person to see that, but I pray that it'll take something. So we see the past differently, and as we do, what happens is that the past changes. So there was a section in my dissertation where I talked about how memories are transformed as they're pulled from the past into the present, and we look at them with these new eyes, and then we put them back in the past where they belong. We're not going to drag them around with us, and they're different from having been pulled into the present. And as we move into the future, those memories continue to change even more. So it's again, a remembering. We're remembered. So the things that hurt us so much, the ways in which we were fearful, angry, resentful, actually become the catalysts of healing. The catalysts of healing. And then steps 8 and 9, this is about repairing the past. And it's repairing the past with present people. And I know that there are some people that we can't make amends to, either they're no longer here. There are a lot of creative ways to do that. Writing a letter, or offering it as an offering. Many ways, to do that. Repairing the past and establishing transparent, humble, human relationships with those we had harmed. I remember my oldest son was the first person I ever made amends to. And I was, maybe 3 weeks sober when I did it, against my sponsor's advice. And after I finished, he folded his arms and he sat there and he said, "So?" That was not exactly the response I was looking for. And then 5 years later, I called him and I said, I did a really horrible job making amends to you. And I wonder if you would give me a redo. And he said yes. And I said, these are the things that I'm aware of. And I went through them, and I said, and I want you to know that if you know anything that I, haven't named, I'm willing to hear that and would, like to hear that from you now. He said, no, I think you've covered all the high points. And today we have a really good relationship. He's been sober many years now, and he's a therapist. So how cool is that? So, these steps are also about developing our ability to live with the past without shame and guilt. And remember earlier I said sometimes when we take these tests and we look at what's been driving our behavior, we develop an incredible sense of self-forgiveness. So I look at myself and I say, of course I was an escape artist. And thank God I finally found alcohol, because that worked for a while for me. That was the great escape. And you know what? That's what caught me in my tracks. And that's what got my attention. So I was able to see it clearly and stop. So we restore relationships where we can and live with losses wherever that's not possible. And folks, that's maturity. That's called being an adult. So we just have to live with some losses. And it's an earmark of maturity and balance. And it's a sign that our impulsive, self-serving character and behavior is changing. And then step 10. And so I put 10, 11, and 12 as kind of a recycle of all of the steps that have gone before. It just kind of keeps going and unfolding. So in 10, we continue to grow in self-awareness, in consciousness, transparency, honesty, and living clean in relationships. So when I wrong, I'm willing to say, I am so sorry that I didn't show up for that meeting. Or I told you I was going to be there at 7 o'clock and I didn't come until 7:30. No excuses. I was wrong. Please forgive me. Step 11, constantly renewing and refreshing our growing and changing relationship with God through prayer and meditation. And how do we do that? We do that by establishing a conscious contact so that the power source of love and grace is living through me, and I become a channel then to others. And then step 12, we offer hope to others because we have experienced help and hope as the result of these steps. So remember when we were talking about the black hole and the cycle, of addiction interaction? That's one cycle. This is a very different cycle, and it produces very, very different results. So, does anybody have any questions or comments at this point? Anything you want clarified? Or anything that you just want to share that is part of your experience about this? Yes?
I was just thinking about a quote from Rumi, the poet. He said, "The wound is the place where the light enters."
Oh, I love that. Did you hear that?
No.
Rumi said, "The wound is the place where the light enters." The wound is where the healing is. And I don't know about you, but it's just like the wound is not the place I typically get excited about going, right? I remember when I was teaching freshmen in college, and I was teaching them in a writing class, and so I had them do a writing assignment the first day of class. And all of them were like really nervous, and I said, "All right, now let's turn in your papers." And they said, "Well, we haven't learned anything yet. Why this?" And I said, "Okay, so imagine that I'm a medical doctor and you have a gaping, bleeding, pussy wound, and you come in to see me, and I say, 'Okay, pull up your pant leg because I need to see what's going on there.' And you say, 'Oh no, it is way too disgusting. I just can't show you that.' Well, if you don't show me, I don't know what we're going to fix, right? So sometimes it's just as simple as that, being willing to look at those wounds. Anybody else? Thank you. Love Rumi. So all of this that we're talking about becomes a journey in sacredness. It really is, it's a sacred transformation that, begins to take place, and, insight and perspective comes from the most unexpected places. Okay, so are we ready to move on beyond the steps? All right. So I'm reading this book lately called Standing at the Edge by a Zen Buddhist Roshi, Joan Halifax, who actually is the director and founder of Upaya Institute and Zen Center down in Santa Fe. And my cousin, who was an EMT, is actually going to school there, learning how to be a crisis chaplain. And so she introduced me to this book, and this statement just stood out for me. So she says, this is a quote from Dr. Remen. Helping, fixing, and serving represent different ways of seeing life. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. When you serve, you see life as whole. Right? So when I was fixing my kids, the message that I was delivering to them is, you're so broken, you can't do this. You need me. Or the other message, when I'm helping you, and I'm trying to be helpful, right? I'm delivering the subconscious message that you're weak and you can't figure this out. It's a powerful statement about how we live in relation to others. So we embrace the attitude and lifestyle of service because we've joined the human circle that acknowledges violation, transformation, restoration, and return. Those cycles are going on all the time in life. We serve because we've begun to see addiction and mental health as a condition that we live with that requires certain care. It's not who we are. It's not who we are. It's what we did. And in this way, we begin to see addiction with all of its drivers and catalysts, and the ways that the ACEs contributed to that condition, and our family of origin that incubated our choices for survival, and ultimately brought us to surrender, healing, and a fuller, more productive life. So there was a time that I was so angry at my parents. I used to pretend that I was adopted because I wasn't like them. I couldn't have really come from that family. And, today I live with a lot of forgiveness toward them because I recognize how wounded they were. And in some ways with my dad, and I just want to say really bad things happened in that family. And they happened to me. But today I can say those wounds were places where the light came in. And what was the statement that you gave us earlier, Judy? You told me.
It's a cheap fix for a sacred wound.
Okay, so if we're fixing from the outside, it's a cheap fix for a sacred wound. And this is what takes us into that depth of healing and transformation. All right. So there was a time when I directed study abroad programs in Rome, Italy. And while I was over there, I was not sober, but I met an amazing Norwegian architect by the name of Christian Norberg Schultz. And I got his book because he was so fascinating. And I read it, and there was this line that absolutely jumped off the page to me. And the statement was, dwelling is to be at peace in a protected place. It wasn't too long after that experience that I ended up getting sober. And I printed out that line and I taped it to the top of my computer. That was when we had computers that were like big square boxes. And I would look at it all the time and I would think, okay, where is that protected place? It's that marriage. It's that house. It's having that certain car, maybe a Volvo, because they're really protected. Maybe it's having a certain job. It was all into the externals. And I remember working really late one night. This was in my workaholics phase in sobriety. And I was working, 12 to 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. And then I would crash on Sundays and, want to commit suicide. And I remember late one night I was working and I looked at that statement and everything shifted. And I said to myself, if I'm not the protected place, nowhere is. If I'm not that protected place, if I don't dwell in a me that's safe, that's secure, that's free, that's experiencing transformation, none of that other stuff matters. I can live in a palace and be miserable because I'm not that safe place. So I'd invite you all to figure out how you can make you safe. And what it invites us to do is to come home. Come home to the me that you were created to be. That unique, special self that only you can be in this world. Nobody else can be that you. And if you don't live that authentic you, there's a void in the world. Let's just put it that way. Because nobody else can do it. Nobody else has had your life. Nobody else has had your experiences. Nobody else has your perspective or your personality or your gifts. Okay, so back to the illustration, and we see that there's a whole lot more above the surface, right? So you see the waves at the bottom, and we've got sobriety going on, and we've been cultivating recovery, and we've been working the cycle of the steps instead of the cycle of the black hole, and we've begun to experience emotional healing. And so on the right is how we do that, and on the left are actually characteristics of what we've become. We become conscious, authentic, living free, mature. And so notice again the expansion of the triangle and that field of perception and how much bigger it has become. That's the fullness of what it means to live with emotional healing. So we go down into the dark in order to bring light to it, and we come back into the light, living the experience of the dark. It takes both. I mean, we don't live in constant daylight. It's not sunny all the time. It's not summer all the time, at least here. And now that we're moving into fall, we're moving into a greater darkness. So what a great time to mine those dark moments in our lives and bring light to them and experience healing. So this is where we begin to live with spiritual consciousness, and conscious contact with God becomes even deeper. We find work in the world where we can be of service, and this applies in any profession. You don't have to be a therapist to bring goodness to the people around you, or to help create a culture of openness and transparency and goodness, of generosity. You just have to be you. So, I love the Serenity Prayer. And the reason I love it is because it presents a really simple framework for approaching everything that happens to me in my life. I see the Serenity Prayer as having 3 columns. Let's say the Serenity Prayer together. It's up there. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So anything that I encounter in life, I say, can I change it or can't I? And if I don't know, then it becomes the question mark. So the 3 columns are what I can't change, and in that instance, I'm asked to accept it and have serenity over the fact that it's there and there is nothing I can do about it. So back to the delinquent taxes, the only way to get my house off the auction block was to pay the delinquent taxes again with, my own money. And I'd already paid those taxes. So what I can change, I'm asked to change and to have the courage to take the steps and the action necessary to do that. And what I don't know, and this is for me a lot of life, it falls into the question mark category or column. I'm asked to basically just ask to know the difference. Ask for wisdom. So I go through my day saying, is this something I can change, God, or not? Show me. And the result of living in this way is with maturity and balance. I also want to talk a little bit about how to heal all of these things. So one of the things that has really been important to me, because I'm kind of a head person, is to get out of my head and into my body. And I do that through story and image and ritual. And in working with those things, I have learned how to name and accept whatever is going on, to grieve, to surrender, to love time alone. I was a person who was just busy all the time. And so learning to be alone and to love that time and to cultivate silence in my life has been a huge step of growth for me. And then learning to listen, just really being present when you're talking with another person. Look them in the eye and hear what they're saying. And if you don't understand what they're saying, ask, tell me more about that. Or what must that have been like for you? Just get curious. So I want to tell a little story on myself. So those first 10 years that I was living with Self-Will Run Riot, sober, as you can imagine, I whined about a lot of things because, it was not perfect, or they weren't doing it right, and they weren't asking me how to do it. And So I would go in every week to my sponsor and I would whine. And finally I went into her and I said, okay, so I realize that my life is nothing but broken pieces, fragments, bits and pieces. Okay, I'll admit some of them are pretty colors. And I'll admit some of them are interesting shapes. But I have no idea what to do with these. And my sponsor went like this, and she said, mosaic or stained glass window? I was furious. I said, okay. So let's say they come together and there's a picture, and what if I don't like the picture? She said, then you've got a problem with God. Okay. I did have a problem with God because I didn't trust anybody. Still at 10 years sober. A few years ago, I was doing a meditation. You know, the rivers here are just incredible, and I often go to the rivers and pray and just sit and be with the river. And there was a time that I was, thinking about the river, and you're going to probably think I'm crazy, but I was talking to the river, and I said, so tell me about yourself. What are you? And the river said, I am the flow. I am the water. I am the banks. I am every obstacle in the riverbed. I'm the river. And that was so enlightening to me because I realized that, I'm not just the water. I'm not just the rocks. It's the whole thing. And so how things come together for me is transformative. Well, it's sort of like those bricks in our life went up one at a time and took how long to get us where we are today. And they take a long time to come down too. So, I work with a treatment center that does a lot of experiential therapies with folks. And recently, one of the therapists took a group of women to a river to go kayaking. And there were 3 women in the group that were scared to get in the kayaks. And so the therapist said, that's okay. Let's just sit here on the bank and we'll just watch for a while. And so they did. And about 15, 20 minutes into it, one of the women said, I wonder how much of my life I've spent sitting on the bank watching life go by. And with that, all 3 of them got in the kayaks. So it's these little, experiential things that come to us where the light bulb goes on and we have that moment of clarity. All right, so, what we've been talking tonight is really how to live whole, how to live holy, right? And to embrace everything that happens to us as sacred. So, this spiritual mentor of mine, Richard Rohr, down in Albuquerque, has written a book called Everything Belongs. Everything belongs. It was like, yeah, right. And I've shifted my perspective on this. So when things come to me, particularly things that don't look like a gift, they don't look like they're going to be a good thing happening, I say, okay, it doesn't look like a gift, doesn't smell like a gift, doesn't taste like a gift, but because I have come to see things from God's point of view, I am going to trust that this is a gift. And it sort of goes back to that old story about the 2 boys that were put in the barn to clean out the barn. And, one was grumbling and, said, this is ridiculous. Why do we have to do this? And the other said, With all this shit, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. So we practice connection and we release all judgment, cultivating a curiosity. This was huge for me because I was just so rigid in the way that I thought about everything. I had judgments. I mean, you know how in the program they'll say, we have no opinions on outside matter? It was like, oh, that would not be me. I have opinions about everything. And they're usually right. So cultivating a curiosity, and I used to pray this all the time. God, please help me live with a spirit of inquiry. Help me live as if I don't know the answers. I don't, that's the truth, but I wasn't able to get there yet. So it was as if I don't know the answers. And to live in conscious contact with God, Spirit, higher power, and abandon scarcity. This is huge, everybody. I can't tell you. I work in business, and most businesses operate with such a sense of scarcity that they can't partner with others. They can't work collaboratively with others. It's like if they even share one tiny piece of what they're doing, somebody's gonna, be one up on them. So I operate on the biblical principle that says, give and it'll be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will God give to you. Give it away. Put it into the flow. Let it go. With money, there's a reason that money is called currency. It's current, it's energy. Let it go. So to live that transformative process of sobriety, recovery, and emotional healing is to live a sacred life. It's a life of consciousness, connection, and change, and we in recovery call it happy, joyous, and free. I remember the first time I heard those words, I was like, yeah, right. It's sort of like the first time that you see the promises on the walls in the rooms of AA, and you go, yeah, right. Fear of economic insecurity will leave me. Don't think so, not anytime soon. And it didn't. Very different story today. And does this mean that we don't encounter difficulties or problems, or that we become immune to disappointment and pain? Not at all. It means that when we encounter life issues, we have acquired the character and path to know how to face it. And we don't have to do this alone. We in this room get it, and we can do it together. So we join with others who are willing to have the courage to live soberly and maturely in the face of all that life brings our way. All challenges then become opportunities, even gifts, if we'll see them that way and trust them to do their work with our cooperation. And so what I say is, let the wild, holy rumpus of life begin. Bring it on. And I'm not daring God in that, you hear. I'm just saying, whatever it is that's going to happen in life, and as I age, I'm aware of things that could happen and probably will. I say, bring it on, for we're free to be fully alive and conscious and connected in it. And we don't even have to do that alone. So thank you so much for being here tonight.